Hello there, members. Welcome and good evening to everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to be here tonight, so I hope that you're all very excited to join me to welcome Andrew Jefford. Hello, Andrew. Cheers.
Hello, Anna. Great to be with you. Yes, I must pour my first glass. It's quite true.
I have just, yes, I've just got my first of the Vinham ready. Really pleased with your selection tonight, Andrew, I must say. It's a bit of a treat for me to be able to buy the wines, and also for a great opportunity for me to introduce Mahesh behind the scenes. So thank you, Mahesh, for joining us, and I hope that he's enjoying something delicious as well. So hello, Mahesh. A little bit of housekeeping before we start, and my thoughts just arrived as well. Wonderful. Fresh from the decanter, so thank you. So welcome to everyone, and Mahesh behind the scenes as well. We've got the live chat tonight, members. I can already see some of you using it. Mahesh will be managing that. Let us know where you are, let us know what you're drinking, and definitely we'd love to hear your opinions about the wines, and perhaps also some interesting anecdotes of your opinions on Andrew's book. My sound is distorted, bear with me. Let me go into my audio settings. So I do apologize. Does that sound better, members? No? Oh, gosh.
It's a bit garlic-like.
Oh, and it was just fine now. So bear with me a moment. I'm going to turn my audio off and then put it back on again. Just bear with me. And how does that sound?
It's still the same, I'm afraid.
Oh.
That's better.
Better?
That's better, yes.
I don't know what I did, but I'm glad. All sorted now?
I think so.
Wonderful. I do apologise. So where were we? We've got Mahesh behind the scenes. He probably did something very fancy that I don't know about, so thank you, Mahesh. Mahesh behind the scenes managing the chat this evening, and please do let us know where you are, what you're drinking, your thoughts on the wines, and also please let us know whether you've read Andrew's book and what you think of it, because of course that is the reason we're here tonight. You're also welcome to use the Q&A. We will have time to ask some questions of Andrew at the end, so please use that, and it will make Mahesh's job behind the scenes far easier in collating the questions. So without further ado, it's best I go into an introduction. So this evening's event is all about the recently published collection of essays, Drinking with the Valkyries. And it's very relaxed this evening. We will guide you along the way. And whilst we do have tastings of the wines, they're not going to be formal tastings. This is far more relaxed than that. So please feel free to get started on your first wine. And I'm also sure that many of you already know Andrew, but it's worthy of me doing a proper introduction. Many of you will be aware of his columns in Decanter magazine, his books. Possibly you've come across him on the Wine Scholar Guild pages, especially I know some members really love that resource. But I do hope that those of you who've enjoyed the recent book as much as I have, either have your copy to hand, or if you haven't managed to get a copy yet, then there is a special discount for members. I have shared it, but I will share it again in the follow-up email. I have to say, it's one of the greatest wine books I've ever read. And I know it's a collection of things, but Dave McIntyre of the Washington Post reviewed it and gave a sentence that I thought was summed it up perfectly. And that's all I'm going to say before we move on. And it was Jefford's essays, I apologize, I'll read it out. Jefford's essays are like that glass of wine at day's end, restorative, uplifting, and enlightening. And I honestly couldn't have put it better myself. Whilst I'm drowning in MW study books, it's been a pleasure to read yours, Andrew. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us. So cheers.
Well, thank you, Anna. Cheers. Great to be with you.
So this evening's sort of MO is to hear a little bit more about the book, and also to hear about your life in wine. But I thought I'd just kick off with a small question, which is a personal question from me, that you famously studied English as a degree with an MA and then a PhD you started as well, but not studied wine in a formal capacity. So my question to you is, do you think that that's what allows you to make wine such an interesting topic?
Well, I wouldn't say so. I mean, I've been a very assiduous student of wine for the last 30 years as I worked in that field. So I wouldn't say that, I'm a sort of wholly innocent wandering around making sort of abstract observations about things. It is very grounded in a lot of study as well. I suppose if there is a difference, it's that I was lucky enough to have a literary training, and not just the literary training. I also worked for 4 years as an editor after the 6 years in university. And that really helped me enormously, probably more than the 6 years in university did, about, leading me to be able to understand what good writing is. And then, well, the other thing I would just say is that I think it's very important for anybody writing about wine to keep their mind refreshed by reading top writers on other subjects. I think that's very important. That's where a lot of the inspiration comes from, reading exciting writing on all sorts of non-fiction topics. And that I think will help you keep your wine writing fresh. So those would be the two things I'd point to as perhaps being contributory to whatever it is I've been able to achieve.
I have to say, yeah, I've been sort of my nose buried in revision books, and reading your passages, they are so full of information, and going back to that review, enlightening, but it isn't, they're sort of spun in such a way and told with such creativity that you feel, you've learned something at the end, but you certainly don't feel like you're being preached to, and it's been a real pleasure.
Right.
So I thought we'd kick off with the subject of terroir. It's something that comes up a lot within all of the producers, should I say, that we interview here at the Wine Society. And it takes terroir in some guise or other, takes quite a large portion of the first part of your book. And then again, there's a chapter called The Party's Over, which I believe is lifted from Decanter, and our misunderstandings between rocks and soil. So I'd really like to kick off with quite an intense question, I suppose, which is, what are your views, or could you share your views on terroir, and especially soils, and why do you think we've become so obsessed with them? And do you think maybe we've somehow missed the point a little as well?
Right. Well, as you say, Anna, that's quite a big question, so I'll try not to go on too long about it. I mean, one of the themes of the book, one of the things I really hope comes across is that for me, it's difference which matters more in wine than hierarchy. I think one of the disadvantages of the great advent of scoring and wine criticism is that it tends to make us think about hierarchy the whole time. And not about difference, that there's no way you can score for difference. It's just not possible. And yet for me, it's really difference that is the most important thing about wine, and the most spiritually and mentally nourishing thing about wine. Now, difference is, yes, I mean, another word for difference really is terroir. It's not the only source of difference, of course. There are the differences in wine attributable to winemaking as well. But the fundamental pulse of difference in wine, its watermark, if you like, or its wine mark, something like that, is really based on terroir. So for me, terroir is the most interesting thing about wine. But it's very hard to define it. So many things feed into this enormous topic that scientists have a great deal of difficulty in actually grappling with it and proving it, if you should want to do that. But I mean, if you want to, perhaps another way to look at it is to offer you another metaphor, which is that place is, or terroir is, the music in wine, and it's that which grape varieties, which we could call the instruments, are there to serve, and it's that which winemakers are there to serve as well, the performers. But the music itself is always terroir. That print of place is always what you're trying to hear in a wine. And yes, I mean, there are two sections of the book. The chapter 2, Some Soils and Some Skies, is very much about that theme, exploring terroir. And then also chapter 4, Some Beautiful Wines, also explores it to some extent. Now, you mentioned the whole soil thing. I think it's very important to say that terroir is much, much more than just soil. we tend, I think, to emphasize soil almost to the exclusion of all else, because it's quite easy to measure. You can look at it, you can see it, it's physically there, you can dig down into it and see all the different elements and so on. And it's obviously what vines are rooted in. So that, as it were, drives our interest in it. But actually the physical side of terroir is by no means the whole story. There's one essay in the book, actually, which is Robert Louis Stevenson's take on wine, comes quite early in the book, called Earth's Cream Skimmed. And I think for a succinct introduction, and a very beautifully written introduction to the physical side of terroir, you couldn't really do better than look at that. And there's also quite an interesting sort of proof of terroir in another essay called Terroir, Tasting and Tonewood, which is an analogy from the musical world, so that you can see how terroir might work in that world as well. But it's not just soil. There's another essay called Dr. Mistral, which is all about the Mistral wind in the south of France, which, for example, is a very important element of terroir for the wines of Châteauneuf-du-Pape and the Southern Rhone in general. Very important contributor towards their particular characteristics. And also, I'm very keen to emphasize the cultural side of terroir too. There's an essay early on about Japanese koshu called Nuance from Disdain, and the cultural side of Japan and Japanese culture, and how people think about the creation of flavor and the cherishing of what the natural world gives is very important to that. There's various other essays in the book too that also emphasize the cultural side of terroir, both positively, but also, as it were, negatively too. So, for example, there's an essay called Angela's Lemon about Cinque Terre, a wonderful place to make wine in Liguria in Italy, but probably doomed. And there's also an essay called The Blue Corrupter about Bandol. Bandol is perhaps the greatest place on the surface of the earth to make Mourvèdre-based red wine, and yet almost all of the wine produced there nowadays is rosé, because the demand for rosé is so strong. So that essay explores that. So, you know, the cultural side of things is also very important for me as well. So I try to explore that a lot too. But whatever, I think in the final analysis, the thing that keeps drawing us back to wine and the engine of difference in wine, which is this wonderfully inspiring thing about wine, is terroir. So yes, it's wonderful fun to chase after that and to look at it and to examine it. But it is a lot more than just soil.
Thank you. I mean, so perfectly put. I have to say, I love Dr. Mistral. I'm currently sat in the Southern Rhone where my parents live, and where I'm about to move. And today was a gorgeous day, but it was the first day that we've not had Mistral here for 2 weeks. And reading Dr. Mistral, I could feel the wind on my face.
And you're still sane after all of that. It meant to drive you crazy after 3 days.
Yeah, only just. I can understand why it drives people mad. But you also mentioned the beautiful essay, Angela's Lemon, on Cinque Terre. And I think for me, one of the great things about the book in particular is it doesn't just paint all wine production as this fabulous, you know, it is often very romantic, but you mentioned the word doomed then. And yes, it's not all perfect, and perhaps winemaking isn't the right choice, or the future of winemaking perhaps isn't the right choice for everyone. And I think you phrase that very, very beautifully in the book and put wine in context. And that's a very impressive thing. I've seen lots of members, mentioning various books, but also explaining how poetic your book is. But it's also practical.
Yeah,
there's an amazing element of practical as well. So, do we think it's time to taste a wine?
I think so.
It leads us quite nicely on, I suppose, because this wine is a wine that talk soil, shall we say? Pardon me. It's certainly a terroir-driven wine. So perhaps, Andrew, could tell us a little bit about this wine and also why you chose it.
Yes, well, Gewürztraminer. is a wine I love. And the essay on Gewürztraminer in the book is actually called An Evening with the Lilac-Berried Mutant. And it's kind of riff on Oscar Wilde and The Love That Dare Not Speak Its Name and all the rest. It's quite a sort of tongue-in-cheek article and a sort of a humorous article. Because I've always felt a little bit guilty about loving Gewürztraminer so much. It's sort of something that you would never dare admit to Jancis Robinson, for example, because, you know, you'd instantly be in terribly hot water, or I imagine I would. It's one of those sort of slightly disreputable wines which you're not really meant to like too much because it's so exotic and kinky and wacky and out there. But that's what I love about it, all of those things. I love the perfume, I love the richness, I love its sort of unpredictability. You know, when you sniff this wine, it's wonderfully classical, actually, as a Gewürztraminer goes. You've got all that lovely sort of jasmine and rose and creaminess in there. But it almost sort of seems to have something sort of pheromonal about its appeal. There's a sort of visceral element to it. There are a few wines like that, and I've always got a very soft spot for those too. I think Merlot can do that on the right bank, particularly in Pomerol. It can exert a sort of almost visceral appeal, and I think that's something that Gewürztraminer can do. This one actually has quite a lot of sort of base to it as well. It's not all in the aerial dimension. And then, you know, it is rich and spicy, sweet-edged, brocaded, but not actually as unctuously sweet as the one I wrote about in the book. Which actually Olivier doesn't make anymore. Perhaps I should just mention a little bit about Olivier's own sort of approach in recent years. I mean, he realized that a lot of people wanted to have more dry wine than Alsace was typically producing, and more than he was typically able to produce, because he cut his yields so dramatically when he made the switch to biodynamics and the focus on quality. And of course, in Alsace, if you produce high quality viticulture, very low yielding wines, you will end up with enormous amount of sugar, not all of which, if you're prepared, as Olivier is, to be courageous enough to let wines really be what they want to be non-interventionist about it, you will end up with a lot of residual sugar. So in recent years, he's produced a range of wines, of which this is one, which are drier. And the only way he's been able to do that is actually by raising yields up towards the limit, which with his very high quality viticulture still gives you wonderfully concentrated, perfumed classical wines, but it also means that they're not saturated in sugar in quite the same way. So this is a little sort of fresher and brisker than the Herrenweg that I wrote about originally. Same soil type. The Herrenweg is sort of gravels, rolled gravels. It's not a slope vineyard. It's not one of the sort of the Grand Cru top quality vineyards, but it has got a lot to offer. I think a lot of its sort of innate richness is the result of that those sort of flatland gravel close to Turkheim, close to the winery itself, richness coming through there. So anyway, I love it. It's a lovely naughty wine, and I'm always going to defend it on that basis.
I sold. No, I think it's lovely, and you're right. Gewürztraminer gets such a bad reputation just for maybe not being quite so serious. And I think it's a lovely wine that doesn't have to be serious, but this is certainly a top quality example.
Yeah.
So for members who are less familiar with it, this is a beautiful example. And as you've mentioned, Olivier, he's you mentioned the word low interventionist, and I think that's something that I'd like to explore with you in a moment as well. It's something that is touched on in the book, but something that Olivier has championed. And then before we move on, if members are upset, I should say, we sold out of the Zinnenhumbrecht last week. It came back in stock temporarily, and you've brought it all up again. So I will have to, and perhaps Mahesh behind the scenes might know when we'll get the next vintage in, but I will let you know, members. If you haven't tasted it before, it's very, very perfumed, very pleasurable and joyful, as Andrew said. So apologies, it's no longer for sale, and you may have spotted that on the slide. So let's chat, if it's all right, Andrew, about low interventionism, what that means. It's more and more a topic of conversation in the wine world. And I will use the word natural because it's something we discuss at the Wine Society. Natural not having a definition being a really challenging concept, and how we best serve our members with how do we understand this movement. And Olivier has led the movement, but maybe not from the angle that many members would know about. So Andrew, you were right to maybe give us a few words. I know you've had a few words in the book, but what does it mean to you?
Yes, well, I wouldn't say that Olivier is a natural winemaker. I don't think he would say that either. But he's very definitely an extremely intelligent, extremely closely observing non-interventionist. Actually, for me, he is one of the greatest winemakers in the world. I mean, I already said this when I wrote The New France, and I believe it even more today, because I've talked to him regularly down the years. You know, he's run so many experiments on different aspects of winemaking and yeast and, you know, whatever you can think of. He's generally done an experiment about it. So whatever he does, it's the result of extraordinarily close observation. And to me, that's really the hallmark of great non-interventionist winemaking, because you know, winemaking is a process, particularly if you're going to use natural yeast, for example, which means a very wide spectrum of yeast in your wine. And you're going to allow your fermentations to take a year and a half if they want to. All of this is extremely risky stuff, and you can only pull it off and produce beautiful wines at the end of it. Beautifully differentiated wines. That's the great goal of all of this. You know, Olivier produces 20, 25 wines a year. You can taste them all in a lineup. They're all completely different from one another. There's no artificial variety just for variety's sake. They really all are absolutely different from each other, because he allows them all to be what naturally the raw materials are going to lead them to be, providing you can guide that process very carefully and very scrupulously in hand. The problem with some natural wines, not all of them, but with some natural wines, is that those making them interpret non-interventionism almost to be non-winemaking. You stand completely back. You let nature do exactly what it wants. And of course, nature's plan is to turn all wine into vinegar as soon as possible. Nature's plan is to let wines oxidize fairly rapidly unless countervailing techniques or approaches are adopted. So lots and lots of things are going to go wrong. And unless you have that scrupulous and very solicitous supervision of what's going on, things can go badly wrong. And that's, of course, the worst side of natural wine. The best side of natural wine is that, you know, it's brought non-interventionism right into the mainstream, and it's made all producers really think about how far they can go down that avenue. And that's been hugely helpful to the world of wine as a whole. And of course, the best natural wines, those which are made by scrupulously observing winemakers, people who are absolutely on top of everything that's going on in their wine at any one time, can often be breathtakingly pure, dramatic, enticing, fresh, all of the things that we might imagine go along with the name natural. So the best of them can be outstanding. And I would also say one other thing about natural wine is that a lot of the popularity, particularly amongst the younger generation, is based on the fact that actually you don't have to learn all the kind of great colossal apparatus of wine knowledge that is so off-putting to many drinkers. It is one producer communicating directly with one drinker. The labeling is all like that. They're often Vin de France. You don't know much about them. It's a very sort of direct approach. The whole apparatus of wine is short-circuited in that sort of way, and I think that has also a lot to do with their appeal. So it's a movement I very much welcome, but you have to distinguish between the successes and the failures, and there are plenty of both, for better or worse.
Absolutely. And I think from a wine society point of view, you sort of have hit the nail on the head. we've discussed with members the idea of a lot of work goes into being a good natural winemaker.
Yeah.
And Olivia is a fantastic example of that.
Yes, and also I would, say, I mean, I'm a Wine Society member. I'm a very keen, proud Wine Society member and have been for many years. And of course, this is the great advantage of a thoroughly trustworthy purchasing intermediary.
Mm-hmm.
If it's been past Marcel or whoever, and it's natural, and he thinks it tastes good, then it probably does taste good. The disasters and the catastrophes can be filtered out at an earlier stage.
Absolutely, that's a very fair point. Yeah, there's a lot of risk removed by that process.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I'm conscious of time, Andrew. So I think it would be lovely to move on to the second wine, if it's all right, which actually you dedicate a whole chapter to in the book as well. Yes. So many people may have tasted it. We've got the 2018 for sale at the Wine Society at the moment, which hopefully some of you have bought. An Italian Barbaresco, and this is the wine we're tasting this evening. It is an older vintage than the one that you discuss in the book, which I believe from memory was the 13. So please could you tell us a little bit about particularly your experience tasting this wine, which you describe so beautifully in the book, and why you chose it for the evening.
Yes, well, it was an easy wine to choose because I love it. It's gorgeous. I mean, I did quite a big sort of research gig in Barbaresco in 2017. And then when I got back from that, the one on sale was 2013. So I bought it. I actually have to say, tasting the 18, I think it's a better vintage than the 13. It's a really good vintage. It's a lovely, lovely vintage of this wine. So if any of you, also have a soft spot for it and want to sort of put some away for a few years, it will age beautifully. It doesn't need to be aged because it's also very accessible at the moment. But it's a really good vintage of this wine. Lots of interesting things about this particular iteration of Barbaresco, some of which are in the book, to do with the cooperative itself. It's a cooperative produced, but a very special cooperative. I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but it is in the book if you want to discover all of that. Perhaps I'll just put an emphasis on two things. The first is that it's, one of the things that intrigued me was why are Barbaresco and Barolo different? They are quite different from each other. Barbaresco is softer, stealthier, more feline, more elegant, more aerial, all of those sort of things. Barolo, sturdier, deeper, denser, more forceful. Obviously, there are differences between the comune in Barolo, but that's roughly the kind of basic difference between the two areas. They're not too far from each other. They're not absolutely adjacent to each other, but they're not too far from each other. There is one commune in Barolo, which is kind of transition zone called Verduno, leading into Barbaresco. And so I sort of set off to try and find all of this. And at first I was completely puzzled because the first thing I discovered was that Barbaresco is actually lower lying, lower altitude than Barolo, and therefore a bit warmer. So wait a minute, that's all wrong. Therefore Barbaresco should be the sturdy, rich, heavy one, and Barolo should be the sort of more light and aerial one. But then I sort of dug a bit deeper. Ostensibly they had the same particular type of soil, these distinctive marls. They're called, I believe, Santa Gata marls. So ostensibly the soils were the same, but this is the thing with terroir. The more you go into it, the more you discover there are nuances which really do make a big difference. So that the soils in Barbaresco tend to have a slightly higher percentage of sand in them than they do in Barolo. Another aspect is that they tend to face west rather than south. And then they're also closer to the river Tanaro, so a little slightly airier, fresher sort of location, and that seems to be the sort of difference between the two zones. And Barolo is more of an enclosed sort of bowl-like terroir, so a lot of heat concentration on warm summer afternoons, often storms and so on in Barolo, which you don't get to quite the same extent in Barbaresco. So all of that was quite interesting. Then the other thing I sort of wanted to draw attention to with this wine within the context of the book is that, to point out that great wines are sort of not always nice. I mean, they're challenging, and that's part of their greatness. And particular, I sort of mentioned bitter notes and a sort of asperity to this wine towards the end of the palate. You notice those sort of things, and it's quite typical. Even though it's a beautiful wine, it's wonderfully aged, lovely silkiness to it, gorgeous aromatics coming off it. But it also, towards the end, has this sort of this bitter edge and this slight sort of asperity to it. And to me, you know, this is so wonderfully Italian. This is quite typical of many Italian wines. You find it in Tuscany as well. You also find it in Veneto. And of course, you know, I sort of saw the tower on the label, and there is a tower in Barbaresco, and it made me think about all the towers in Tuscany, the incredible towers in San Gimignano. Used to be even more of them in the past, and they have a sort of, they have a beauty, but they also have a hostility. There's a sort of aggression to it. And then I started thinking about Dante's Divine Comedy, which is a sort of a book which is generated almost from bitterness and asperity and castigation, and sort of, it's the greatest work of literature of getting even ever. You know, Dante gets even with pretty much everybody he ever knew in that book. Of course, there are other aspects to the book too. It's not just that, but it just sort of all came together and seemed to me something very sort of quintessentially Italian. And you know, the wine almost taught me those things, or made me think of those things, took me out in those sort of directions. And so the piece in the book is sort of a little generation of that kind of thing, in fairly dense and succinct form. None of the pieces in the book is hugely long, and that one certainly isn't, but that was the riff behind that one, as it were.
It was lovely. I really enjoyed that. And I think actually the lovely riff, as you say, those sound bites doesn't do it any justice. But the really nice nature of the book is you do have these little snippets into an experience that obviously was much greater. You mentioned you were doing research, but it goes back to that original review. They're a glass of wine. You can just take the book, open it, read a chapter, and immediately after reading that chapter, I was desperate for a Barbaresco.
Yes, you don't have to read the book from beginning to end. You can dip and dive as much as you want, and yeah, I hope it's useful like that.
Absolutely. It makes it, for any members that haven't read it yet, it makes it an absolutely wonderful book. I've got the Kindle on my phone as well as the actual book itself, and it makes it a great book for a sort of bus journey or something.
Yeah.
You pick a little topic and get transported for 5 minutes. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
So we've had 2 wines, and I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I did find one particular chapter in your book very interesting. From me, from a running tastings point of view, the chapter is called Taste First, Then Look. And it's a discussion on alcohol. And often a question we get a lot at tastings, if we don't put the alcohol on, people will ask us immediately, what is the alcohol? And we've actually tasted 2 wines with quite naturally high levels of alcohol this evening already. But I would be really interested to hear your thoughts, should we say, discussions around alcohol imbalance.
Yes. Well, I didn't know that you don't declare the alcohol at your tasting, so well done. I'm so thrilled to hear that. I mean, I hate this debate in lots of ways, because for me it's caused immense damage in the wine world. Particularly, I'm not so much, well, I am thinking of consumers to some extent, but even more of producers, because the moment producers start getting neurotic about the alcohol, they often end up picking too soon, and you end up with wines which are very taut and tight and inarticulate. Yes, they have tons of acid balance if really that's what you want, but they're also muzzled to some extent. They're sort of imprisoned and not able to express themselves. I mean, to me, all that really matters is that you pick at perfect ripeness for the variety of varieties that you have in that place, in that season. Okay, so that's all 100% contingent. You can't write rules for that at all. There's no formula. And if, of course, it can be that you pick at perfect ripeness and then you find the final balance is wrong or the pH is too high or whatever. And that really is telling you that you haven't got the right varieties planted for that place in that climate. And by the way, overripe is just as bad as underripe. I mean, I'm not, only castigating underripeness. Overripeness is horrific too, particularly with oak. Horrible, horrible combination. But perfect ripeness gives you this sort of wine of maximum expressiveness, maximum beauty, maximum articulacy, but it really doesn't have anything to do with any particular level of alcohol or any particular level of acidity, come to that either. All of those figures can zoom up and down completely depending on what it is and where it's coming from. So to me, to sort of, fix on the alcohol before you've even tried the wine and reach any kind of conclusion about the wine just because it's 14.5 or 15%, is really, cognitive bias. It's a deviation from rationality and judgment. It's going to skew your judgment. And so that's why I sort of really I understand why this information has to be on labels, but in many ways, I really regret the fact that it does have to be on labels, because really what matters is tasting and drinking. Drinking is incredibly important. Drinking is even more important than tasting, because drinking is really, as the wine goes down your esophagus and into your stomach, you're also measuring the success of the harmony of the wine in that way too. And there are many wines at 14.5 or 15 that you will just not notice. They will silkily slide down. They will sit in the stomach beautifully. They'll be wonderfully digestible. And there are other wines at 12.5 that won't do that at all. And so if you just went on the alcohol, you'll have led yourself up the garden path, I'm afraid. So that's why I deplore the simplistic discussion of this particular topic.
Mm. And I really appreciate it. And I think you also mentioned a few times in the book about blind tasting versus sighted tasting and the benefits of understanding what you're tasting. And I think alcohol is one of those things that people want to lead with, and it should never be the leading topic of all tasting.
Yeah.
So I have to say, there was one particular chapter essay, I think is probably the better way to describe it. One essay in the book that I'd never read before, and it was the piece that really floored me, and so I was desperate to talk to you about it. I did mention already, members, to Andrew, that this was something I was desperate to speak about. It's called A Sea Interlude. It comes quite early in the book, and it focuses on the charms of Picpoul de Pinet, but it frames it in the world of fine wine. And I think particularly pertinently, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about fine wine. I don't want to go too long over time, but please, would you mind just having a little mention of that particular topic and essay, and share your thoughts of what fine wine is to the members, Andrew? I think it's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my contention in this essay, as you've said, Anna, is that Picpoul de Pinet one of the things I'm always trying to emphasize in the book is personal experience of wine. If you want to dress it up with a fancy philosophical name, you could call it a sort of phenomenology of wine, but it's this personal lived experience of wine, which to me is something very, very important. And if you're going to put an emphasis on that, without any of the apparatus of standard wine knowledge and hierarchies and all the rest, then you will fairly soon realize that which is defined as fine wine is not necessarily always fine at all, and that there are other wines which are never allowed to be fine wines, which for you can be fine. And for me, Picpoul de Pinet is a wine that can do that. We almost have to approach it by sort of the negative side of the fine wine definition, but many fine wines are actually rather disappointing wines that have names that evoke great expectations. They have the fancy Burgundy Premier Cru name or whatever, and so we regard it as being fine wine, but they're not. They're actually quite disappointing wines. They fall flat. The Picpoul name will never evoke those kind of expectations, but it rarely disappoints in my experience. Very often it is exactly what you're looking for when you you reach for a beautifully soothing yet place centered white wine from the south of France. I think another issue to do with fine wine is that, you know, the standard definitions of fine wine tend to discriminate against what we could call quiet wines, undemonstrative wines. If it's undemonstrative, by definition, it hasn't got the sort of handles that wine critics are looking to predicate their, you know, their 300-word paragraphs on, descriptions on. You know, Picpoul de Pinet and, you know, quite a lot of Italian white wines as well, actually, don't really do that. They're quiet, more discreet wines. They don't have the same kind of handles, but they can still be deeply satisfying, even though they don't have all this ostensible, you know, stuff you grab hold of. Yeah, Muscadet, Ken has just pointed out, that's absolutely right. So, you know, that can also be fine. That undemonstrative nature can be really something very beautiful and satisfying. And then finally, you know, fine wine is often sort of regarded as being something that must be sort of expensive and or rare. But to me, it really needs to be something, or it only has to be something which is beautiful and unique and true to a place, and impossible to duplicate elsewhere. That to me is the sort of the basis of the potential for fineness in wine. And again, Picpoul de Pinet would absolutely tick all of those boxes. And indeed, I sort of, perhaps I go too far in this essay, in that I suggest that actually that, you know, you could put quite a lot of well-made Picpoul de Pinet into bottles that said Chablis or even said Chablis Premier Cru. And my guess is that at least 60% of those buying the Chablis or the Chablis Premier Cru and drinking the Picpoul de Pinet would be very happy with what they drink and would not have any cause whatsoever to say, wait a minute, this isn't right. They're actually quite close in style. Oh, okay, yes, of course, Chablis has that, you know, stoniness and that percussiveness and that acid edge that Picpoul de Pinet generally doesn't have. But, you know, most drinkers would be equally happy with that wine. And yet, when you think about their images, they're completely different. So that's the sort of basis of what I'm trying to say there. I would really urge every wine drinker, all of those present here listening today, to create their own pantheon of fine wines. That's something very useful, very precious, and you probably save yourselves a lot of money if you work at that and stick to that, rather than having to go out on a limb and buy these hugely expensive experiments that don't always perform terribly well.
I couldn't agree more. The finest wine in our household at the moment is the Society's White Rioja, for anybody who's interested.
There you go.
It's exactly as you described. I mean, that is a loud wine rather than a quiet one, but it's definitely unmatchable. You know, it's unique and it's honest to itself, and for me, wonderful. So
yeah.
On the notion of quiet to loud wines, I think probably in the interests of time we should move on to our Madiran.
Yes.
I've seen a bit of chat going on about what defines a fine wine, so by all means continue to talk about that should that interest you, members. I know it does a lot, but I am conscious we still have Madiran and a port to talk about, so I'll hand back over to you, Andrew, to talk about the Pichard signature Madiran 2009, which some members may have opened last night and some will be opening for the first time this evening.
Yes, I mean, I opened mine this afternoon just to, you know, to give it the air that Madiran seems to relish. Very made, of course, largely from Tannat grape variety, which is a very reductive grape variety, so it soaks up the air and relishes it. It's lovely to have a 2009. I mean, to be able to buy a 2009 anything, you know, without completely busting the budget is a great opportunity. Yeah, there you go, £16 a bottle. I mean, that's pretty amazing. Madiran is a wine I'm enormously fond of. It's definitely up there in my pantheon. In fact, there's an essay in the book which is called The Antidote, which is all about Madiran, which, you know, sort of explores the notion of drinking Madiran in winter and what it can, again, this personal experience, what it can actually do for you. The antidote being an antidote to, well, to cold, to drained light, to exhaustion, to the fear that there will be no return, to the terror inspired by the indifferent stars. Perhaps it's traveling it on a bit too thick, but sometimes it really does come across like that. It's a wine that, you know, if I am feeling low or depressed, I reach for it. Generally cheers me up quite a lot, because it's one of those wines that seems to sort of summarize. It's a Gascon wine, and it seems to summarize the sort of the remote Gascon countryside wonderfully well. In fact, this wine, you know, it's not by any means simply fruity at all. It's got lots of that sort of undergrowth and earth and mushroom and, you know, dry leaf, and all of those sort of things are lurking in there. That's an advantage of having it with this age it's got on it. And it also has this lovely sort of density and richness to it. You know, it's almost like sort of drinking blood sometimes. It can be that sort of that moving and that restoring. I mean, this one is, yeah, actually, to me, this one seems relatively approachable. The tannins have softened out quite nicely now.
Yes, I think sometimes that can be the bit that puts people off, and it shouldn't really. You know, particularly with this age, like you've mentioned, Andrew, 2009. Yeah. I think it's in a perfect spot.
And of course, we also should say, I mean, the first two wines we could drink with great pleasure on their own. This wine you really want food with. I mean, you really want to sit down to something fairly hearty, and then it will really come into its own. It's often true with notably tannic wines, because the tannins are actually, you know, the purpose of tannin in wine, or one purpose of tannin in wine, is to bond with the protein that you're going to be eating with a meal, that the two bond together and as it were soften in each other in each other's embrace. And that works wonderfully well. So this is definitely a food wine. But yeah, fantastic complexity there, a real sense of place. You know, I don't know if any of, I'm sure some of those listening in have been to Madiran, but it really is what the French call the fin fond du monde, the back of nowhere. It's awfully hard to get to. It's sort of it's the actual appellation zone is on 3 different départements, which creates a lot of administrative hassles for those making wines there. But once you get there, you know, boy, it's quiet at night, and you will really feel way, way, way away from everywhere. And the view of the indifferent stars above you will be very, very dramatic. So all of that somehow is in there for me. And yeah, it's fantastic wine. I love it. And I would definitely not ever want to be without a few bottles of Madiran to see me through the winter.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad you shared this with me. It's actually a wine that, you know, you taste a couple of times and not forget about, but I think all of the ways that you've described it remind me, is probably the best way to say it, that you've reminded me that I must drink more of this wine, and that it keeps so beautifully and is such good value for money, that actually it can be that perfect.
Yeah, and I know the Wine Society does en primeur offers with Alain Brumont, I think, and you know, those are very, you know, Brumont reckons he's got all of the top sites in Madiran sewn up in his own domain somewhere or other. So those are very, very good wines. Well worth buying those en primeur and tucking them away. It's also a terrifically good wine if you haven't got very good storage, which I don't down here in the south of France. I'm speaking to you from near Montpellier. Summers are punishingly hot nowadays, and my wine is just under the house, and I'm afraid it gets awfully hot during the summer. But Madiran can sail through those difficult storage conditions almost unsullied. That's another reason why I admire it so much.
Good. The London flat wine. I often had troubles when I lived in a flat in London for challenges. Yeah. We've had so many questions, Andrew. So what I might do is, if it's all right with you, move on to the port, talk about that, and then hopefully we'll be able to squeeze some questions in. We've had absolutely masses. So if it's all right, we'll sail straight on through to that. To mention members, and I'm sure Andrew will talk about it, the age of the port is intentional. Sadly, my waiter has earlier brought me a little bit of sediment in mine, so he didn't do a very good job, but hopefully my instructions about how to drink it were better than those that I gave to my husband. But there are some incredible quotes in the essay, Drinking with the Valkyries, the title essay of the book, about intense young port. So it is completely intentional. So I'll allow you to taste alongside Andrew's beautiful description, which is the way it should be.
Yeah, well, and also, as you point out, Anna, there are actually 2 essays on port in the book, and on the face of it, they seem almost to be contradictory, because one is about ultra young port and the other is about crazy old port, over 100 years old. And what I say in the one about young port, which is the title essay, Drinking with the Valkyries, is that, for goodness sake, if you love wine, do not, under any circumstances, let slip the opportunity of drinking vintage port in earliest youth, because it is just about the most exciting thing you can ever sniff and put into your mouth. I call it the wine drinker's equivalent of zorbing or wing walking or base jumping or even cage fighting, because everything that's happened to that wine in a very, very small, remember that it comes from the top vines of all of the greatest Douro estates. And then it's smashed and pounded and pummeled and has all hell beaten out of it for a couple of weeks till it's only half fermented. And then, of course, all of that process stops. So believe me, there's nothing you could do to grapes more violent and brutal than what happens to them in the actual pre-fortification stage of making vintage port. And we're talking about fantastic grapes from a fantastic growing place. And so the end result is sort of tumultuous excitement. Drinking with the Valkyries puts the screamers on you, as I say in the essay. Okay, it's not what you're meant to do, and it's not sublime harmony. It's not the sort of pleasure that we derive from the Barbaresco a couple of wines ago, but it's still something everybody should do at least once or twice in their lifetime. And if you love vintage port and buy a case of it, for goodness sake, don't leave the whole lot for 30 years. Do get stuck into some of it much earlier on. In my opinion, I'm not a great fan of super aged vintage port. It will age, and it has the complexity to age, and indeed it will be something very subtle at the end. But to me, it's almost like sort of super aristocratic ruby port by the time it's 30 or 35 years old. I just rather have the excitement of youth. And then the other essay is about a very, very old port, an 1882 port, which Graham's released in tiny quantities, called Ne Oubli. They released it at 130 years old. But the difference there is that it had spent most of that time aging in barrel. In other words, it had been through a kind of Madeira aging experience, not the vintage port aging experience, which is all aged in bottle. And therefore, there'd been a huge amount of evaporation and reduction had gone on. So the end result of that is a sort of extraordinary distillate. Some of people attending will certainly have tasted very old Australian fortified wines. You can taste some of that in those wines, as you can in vintage Madeira, which is very rare nowadays and super expensive. Very hard to find the great ones anymore. But this particular aged single vintage Collietta, we would call it, port, was absolutely extraordinary as well. And what I also say in that essay is that many wines from the 19th century you do occasionally come across. They're there in cellars and producer cellars and that sort of thing, and they're always served with great reverence and revered, and that's fine. But very often they're rather disappointing as table wines. Whereas if they've been fortified in the first place, then they have the sinew to go the distance. They will be held by the alcohol in a something that approximates a youthful or a fresh state, while all of this evaporation and reduction is going on. And then the end result of that is absolutely mind-blowing. So if ever you want to, supposing you're given the chance, taste a great 19th century wine, and you're offered the difference between, let's say a 19th century Burgundy and a 19th century Collietta port, I would always go for the 19th century Collietta port because it's liable to be in much better shape.
Wonderfully explained. Thank you so much, Andrew. And I will mention to members, these half bottles I think are fantastic. and I'm not sure whether they're for sale anywhere else. I think we may have an exclusive on these. Don't quote me on that. What I love about these is you can buy 12 halves. And so actually the idea of drinking some now and holding on to some, and you can really see evolution if you're drinking 12 smaller bottles. So if you can, what a great idea. So thank you. I mean, there's no other way to say it, and I'll say it properly in a moment, but we have got lots of questions, so I hope you don't mind, Andrew. I might
not at all.
throw a couple your
I should
way.
also say, just before we start, it's been very moving to see some of the chat come up, because I've I've discovered a couple of old school friends that I've literally not seen since school who are actually slotting in tonight. So that's fantastic. That means a lot. That's great. Anyway, let's now go on to
that's
questions.
Lovely.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen a few bits pop up, and largely huge amounts of praise as well. So an incredible evening, and members will agree. So just a couple of questions. I think we may only have time for a couple. I think one question that would really interest members is, Elizabeth has asked, many participants have praised Andrew's writing, but Andrew, which writers do you enjoy reading?
Okay, now, do we mean wine writers, or do we mean...
I assume so, but I'm happy for you to do a mixed bag for us.
Yeah. Well, wine writers, you have to mention Hugh Johnson, of course. When I first began, Hugh Johnson and Jancis Robinson were my, great inspirations. The wonderful achievements they both made. Jancis, I think, is more, the intelligence gatherer. The actual writing quality you would have to give to Hugh, I think, and I think Jancis would agree about that. Beautiful writing, always a great pleasure to read. Other writers, younger generation, I mean, it's sort of a bit invidious if I start naming this or that colleague, so I'm actually going to sort of back off that a bit, but there are some excellent younger writers, I'm happy to say. And what I would be looking for as a reader is always just somebody who can step back, somebody who can see things originally, somebody who isn't afraid to go off the leash a bit. That people aren't always allowed to, by the way. So you have to be lucky enough to be in a place where you're allowed to go off the leash. But that's the sort of thing that can really create the best writing. So yeah, that was what I probably want to say there. And
that's great. And I think that also answers another question we had about your sort of mentors. And I think that you've had some lovely influence from both of those two people in your career, if I'm correct.
Absolutely, yeah.
I've got another great question that I'm desperate to ask. It might be slightly contentious, but John Crawford has said he really enjoyed the essay Board Rigid on the rating and scoring of wine. A high score does seem to influence our expectations significantly. Is there a better way?
Well, I sort of have a go at schools several times in the book, and I'm not a big fan of them. I do use them because if I didn't, nobody would employ me, and I do see a role for them as a sort of shortcut to enthusiasm and as a way of sort of sorting things out in quite a, we're not going to say goodbye to schools. They're going to be with us forever and ever and ever, whether we like it or not. But to me, it's the description that really matters much more. And it's in particular when you can see personal enthusiasm sing out of the description. That's always what I'm looking for. When you see that a wine has really meant a difference to somebody, really got through to them in a vivid and authentic way. Only the words can tell you that. The score can never tell you that. And scores, often the higher scoring wines are less good, as far as I'm concerned, and less interesting than the lower scoring wines. So scores aren't even working correctly, as far as I can see. Very often there are wonderful 89 or 90 point wines, whereas the 94 point wine or the 96 point wine is just, it's got XXXXXX. You can hang all the adjectives on it, but it's still not a very nice wine to drink. So doesn't even do a great job in the way it's meant to. So I'm a score skeptic. but I do have to use them, and I do accept that there is a role for them. It's just, please don't ever take them too seriously. That's the big mistake.
Thank you. I think that's yeah, wise advice. I think Mahesh is going to launch our poll whilst I ask one final question. So we have got, for anybody tasting along this evening, we have got a poll to let us know your favourite wine of the night. You can select more than one if there's more than one of you tasting this evening. I know that. Don't want to cause contention. But what I would like to ask you finally, I'm sure it's a question you've been asked before. This is from James. What was your first wine experience? And since then, is there one wine that you would say has been a seminal experience?
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm just going to very quickly give you 3 answers to that. Honestly, the very first sort of wine experience that made a big impression on me was when my brother and I, aged around 11, my middle brother and I, were given some champagne to drink. And we instantly looked at each other and said, it tastes like vomit. Because it was, what we'd noticed was this very, very acidic taste in our mouth. And what did that remind us of? The very, very acidic taste of stomach acid in your mouth after you've been sick. So that was my first ever tasting note. Champagne tastes like vomit. We came both to love it with great devotion later, but we weren't super impressed to start with. Second answer is, I first got into wine by making it at home because my dad was a vicar. I had 2 brothers. There's 4 men in the family. All we had was a bottle of cider for Sunday lunch, and I decided this was definitely not enough. So I started making homemade wines using grape juice concentrate and nettles and elderflowers and carrots and all the other sort of stuff. And that really taught me a lot about the process of making wine, about fermentation. And also I began to find my way towards making better homemade wines. So all of that was very formative. And I can still remember some of those wines. I can still remember the demijohns. I can still hear the sound of the plop, plop, plop as the airlocks quietly, carried on as we sat watching TV in the evening. That was the second experience. And then I think the third experience was when I was at university, lodging with a singular household. Big story there, but we haven't got time to go into that. And I just remember one lunch, they were a big gourmet household, and there was a bottle of Beaujolais for this Sunday lunch. Can't remember the vintage, can't remember the name, anything like that. But I just, how Beaujolais can just suddenly sing, perfume, fruit, it surges down your throat. It's so gorgeous, so refreshing, so delicious to drink when it's on song. And that particular bottle of Beaujolais was completely on song. And I thought, crikey, wine can do this. And then I was really hooked after that. So those are the 3 experiences that I'd like to mention.
Perfect. I actually love the honesty that you can't remember who produced it, what vintage. It was just the wine in your glass on that particular moment.
Yeah.
I think that's fabulous. So I'm going to quickly share the poll results. You'll be pleased to know, Andrew, that every wine this evening scored beautifully, as we just discussed our points. But we did have the Gewürztraminer and the Madiran were the 2 favourite.
Oh, that's great. Fantastic.
So, but every single wine received some nods this evening.
Brilliant.
So on that note about scoring wines and then giving you some scores for wines, I would just like to say I cannot thank you enough. It's been a pleasure to host this event with you, Andrew. I feel like a sponge that's just wanted to absorb every single word you've said, and members are certainly in agreement with me. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you to Mahesh behind the scenes and Hermione as well. And I do hope, Andrew, that you'll come back and do this again for our members, because it sounds like they could have listened to you for hours and hours and hours, as could I. And then lastly, just if you do want to listen to more of Andrew or read more of Andrew, I should say, please go and buy the book. I can't recommend it more highly. It's really, honestly, it's brought wine back to this beautiful place when I've been studying so hard for me. So it's really been very inspiring to listen to you. So thank you so much, Andrew.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Good evening, all.
Lovely.